What will happen to Donald Trump if courts rule his DOJ abused protesters' rights? A stunning development is unfolding in America's courts that could carry massive consequences for Donald Trump. Judges are now weighing whether his Department of Justice crossed the line when it targeted peaceful protesters during his presidency. If the courts ultimately rule that Trump's DOJ abused citizens' constitutional rights, the fallout could be explosive, not just legally, but politically. Such a ruling could reshape how history views Trump's use of executive power, while also influencing his ongoing efforts to return to the White House. The implications for civil liberties, accountability, and the limits of presidential authority are enormous. Stay tuned as we break it down right now. The relationship between presidential power and the protection of civil liberties has long been a delicate balance in the American system of government. Every administration, regardless of political affiliation, faces moments when questions arise over whether the use of federal authority respects constitutional principles or undermines them. During the presidency of Donald Trump, these questions became particularly urgent in the context of nationwide protests and public demonstrations. His Department of Justice often pursued an aggressive prosecutorial strategy that raised alarm among civil liberties advocates, local communities, and eventually federal judges themselves. The transcript of the hearing before Judge Zia Faruqi provides one of the clearest illustrations of these tensions. If courts ultimately rule that the Department of Justice under Trump systematically abused protesters' rights, the implications will be broad and lasting. They will extend beyond the personal legal risks facing Trump to touch the institutional integrity of the Justice Department, the precedent for future administrations, and the broader trust of citizens in democratic governance. This script explores the potential outcomes and consequences, analyzing the issue in depth with reference to constitutional law, historical examples, and the political context of Trump's presidency. During the protests that swept across American cities, federal prosecutors brought forward a significant number of cases. Many of these cases were built on relatively minor incidents, such as damaging property, shouting political slogans, or resisting officers in non-violent ways. The case of Edward Dana, who allegedly damaged a light fixture while shouting politically charged remarks, stands as a representative example. Instead of being treated as a routine local offense, his case was escalated into a federal matter. He was detained for a week and faced the possibility of severe charges. These actions suggested a broader strategy in which the Department of Justice was not simply responding to specific crimes, but rather using its power as a deterrent against dissent. Prosecutors appeared to pursue charges not because they believed they could secure lasting convictions, but because the process itself served as a punishment. Detaining individuals, creating arrest records, and threatening them with federal prosecution sent a chilling signal to anyone considering participation in protests. Federal judges began to take notice of this pattern. They questioned whether prosecutors were meeting their obligations to pursue justice fairly or whether they were subordinating those obligations to political imperatives. The comments of Judge Faruqi, who criticized DOJ attorneys for treating citizens' lives as props in political theater, demonstrate how deep judicial concern had become. The transcript describes a heated courtroom exchange in which Judge Faruqi directly confronted DOJ lawyers. He accused them of undermining constitutional democracy, of pursuing cases that lacked merit, and of damaging the credibility of the Justice Department in front of juries and judges across the nation. He criticized the apparent strategy of arresting first and investigating later, treating individuals as statistics for press conferences or social media narratives. What is striking is not only the judge's language, but also his insistence on accountability. He ordered the DOJ to submit written explanations detailing their decisions, demanded to know why higher officials were absent from the courtroom, and encouraged defense attorneys to consider civil remedies against the government. This level of judicial intervention reveals just how seriously courts viewed the possibility that constitutional rights were being systematically infringed. Such judicial rebukes are not simply rhetorical moments. They create a record. If multiple federal judges document a pattern of prosecutorial abuse, higher courts may take notice. Appellate rulings could affirm that the Department of Justice, under the direction of the executive branch, crossed the line from legitimate law enforcement into unconstitutional repression. Several constitutional amendments are directly implicated in this scenario. The First Amendment protects free speech and peaceful assembly. Arresting and prosecuting individuals for shouting political slogans or participating in demonstrations risks violating that protection. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, which includes detentions without sufficient cause or cases built on flimsy evidence. The Fifth Amendment guarantees due process, requiring that prosecutions meet basic standards of fairness and legality. When federal prosecutors pursue weak cases that collapse almost immediately, the question arises whether due process has been respected at all. If the process is used not to adjudicate real crimes but to intimidate, it may amount to a form of punishment without trial. That contradicts the core of American constitutionalism. Beyond these specific rights, the separation of powers is also implicated. The Department of Justice is part of the executive branch, but its mission is to enforce the law impartially, not to serve political strategies. If a court rules that DOJ actions were directed by the president for political purposes, it would mark a violation of that principle and raise questions about the abuse of executive authority. If courts establish that the Department of Justice under Trump engaged in systemic violations of protesters' rights, several legal consequences could follow. While Trump, as president, enjoyed immunity from certain suits while in office, those protections are not absolute. Former officials can face civil suits or even criminal investigations if evidence emerges that they directed unlawful actions. Civil litigation could be one immediate outcome. Protesters who were wrongfully detained or prosecuted may bring lawsuits against the federal government. If courts find that the DOJ acted under explicit direction from the president, Trump could be named as a defendant in civil cases. Such suits could result in financial damages, legal costs, and long-term reputational harm. Criminal liability is a more complex question. Prosecutorial discretion is broad, and it is difficult to establish criminal responsibility for policy decisions. However, if evidence surfaces that Trump knowingly ordered or encouraged the use of federal power to violate constitutional rights, prosecutors could consider charges related to abuse of power or deprivation of rights under color of law. These statutes have historically been applied to officials who misuse authority to target individuals unlawfully. Even if criminal charges never materialize, the legal findings themselves would be consequential. A formal judicial conclusion that the Trump DOJ abused protesters' rights would form part of the historical record and could shape how future courts interpret presidential power. Legal consequences are only part of the story. Political consequences often matter more in shaping how a presidency is remembered. If courts conclude that Trump's DOJ systematically abused protesters' rights, this would add to a narrative of executive overreach and disregard for democratic norms. Political opponents would use such rulings to argue that Trump endangered constitutional democracy. Supporters may frame them as partisan judgments, but the authority of federal courts carries weight with the public. The image of judges openly chastising DOJ attorneys for treating citizens' rights carelessly could resonate far beyond legal circles. For Trump's political career, particularly if he seeks office again, such rulings could complicate his efforts to portray himself as a defender of American freedoms. They could undermine his claims to represent ordinary citizens by highlighting instances where his administration targeted individuals for exercising those very freedoms. The broader legacy issue is how future generations of scholars, students, and voters will interpret Trump's presidency. If judicial findings reinforce the perception of abuse of power, that perception may endure regardless of short-term political outcomes. The Department of Justice is one of the most respected institutions in the federal government, but its reputation depends on the perception of impartiality. If courts rule that it was used as a tool to suppress dissent, this would inflict lasting damage. Trust between citizens and prosecutors could erode. Communities might see federal charges as political rather than legal instruments. For career prosecutors who serve across administrations, such rulings would be deeply demoralizing. They would face the challenge of restoring credibility, demonstrating that the institution can act fairly regardless of political leadership. Congressional oversight could intensify, with lawmakers demanding reforms to prevent similar abuses in the future. Proposals might include clearer limits limits on the use of federal resources in protest contexts, stronger reporting requirements, or independent review mechanisms. The reputation of the Justice Department abroad could also suffer. International observers often look to the United States as a model for rule of law. Findings of systematic rights violations would complicate American efforts to promote democracy and human rights globally. History provides several instructive parallels. During the civil rights era, federal and local authorities often clashed over the treatment of protesters. Courts played a vital role in ensuring that peaceful demonstrators were not silenced by unjust prosecutions. Judicial rulings at that time strengthened civil rights protections and established precedents still invoked today. Another comparison can be made with the Nixon administration. Although the circumstances were different, questions of executive overreach and misuse of federal agencies for political purposes ultimately contributed to Nixon's resignation. The lesson is that the abuse of state power for political ends, when revealed, carries heavy consequences not just for individuals, but for the legitimacy of government. If courts now rule against Trump's DOJ, the episode may enter this historical lineage as another moment when judicial oversight preserved constitutional boundaries. It would reinforce the role of courts as a counterbalance to presidential excess. A court ruling confirming abuses would have implications beyond Trump. It would send a clear message that federal agencies cannot be used to suppress protest movements. This would strengthen protections for future demonstrations regardless of political context. Activists, community groups, and civil liberties organizations would gain confidence that courts will enforce constitutional standards. At the same time, such rulings could shape how future administrations deploy federal resources. Presidents may hesitate before directing DOJ or other agencies against protesters, aware that courts could intervene. This chilling effect on executive overreach would be a positive reinforcement of constitutional checks and balances. The public conversation about the right to protest would also evolve. In an era when demonstrations are common responses to social and political grievances, reaffirming these rights would help sustain democratic culture. The transcript also highlights how federal enforcement intersected with immigration cases, particularly arrests conducted in or around courthouses. If courts rule that the DOJ abused protesters' rights, attention may also turn to whether similar patterns existed in immigration enforcement. Vulnerable individuals, such as asylum seekers or survivors of domestic violence, already face obstacles in accessing justice. Reports of ICE arrests at courthouses discourage victims from appearing in hearings or seeking legal protections. A judicial finding of rights abuses in the protest context could fuel broader litigation challenging enforcement practices in immigration. The symbolic message would be significant. Communities often measure the fairness of government not only by its treatment of citizens, but by its treatment of the most vulnerable. If abuses are confirmed, the pressure to reform enforcement practices across agencies would intensify. If federal courts issue strong rulings against the Trump DOJ's handling of protesters, Congress may feel compelled to act. Legislators could hold hearings to investigate how decisions were made, who authorized them, and what safeguards failed. Such hearings would not only assign responsibility but also consider reforms. Possible reforms include clarifying the limits of federal jurisdiction in protest-related cases, enhancing the independence of prosecutors from political directives, and strengthening oversight mechanisms within the DOJ. Legislation might also aim to protect courthouse access for vulnerable individuals, preventing enforcement actions that discourage participation in the justice system. These debates would shape not only the immediate aftermath of Trump's presidency, but also the broader trajectory of American governance. The balance between executive authority and civil liberties is constantly renegotiated, and moments of crisis often produce lasting reforms. The world watches closely when the United States confronts questions of democracy and rights. If courts determine that protesters' rights were abused, the perception of American democracy abroad could suffer. Allies may question U.S. credibility in promoting human rights internationally. Adversaries could exploit the episode to argue that American critiques of their practices are hypocritical. Conversely, if the judicial system demonstrates resilience, identifying abuses, holding officials accountable, and reinforcing protections, this could strengthen America's reputation. The contrast between executive overreach and judicial correction would illustrate the durability of constitutional checks and balances. For global audiences, this would be a reminder that democratic institutions can survive even when tested. Perhaps the most enduring consequence of a court ruling against Trump's DOJ would be its impact on the scope of executive authority. Presidents often test the boundaries of their power. Judicial rulings define those boundaries. If courts now establish that federal prosecutors cannot be deployed to suppress protests through weak or punitive cases, future presidents will have to govern within that precedent. This outcome would not strip the executive branch of its power to enforce law and order. Rather, it would clarify that such power must be exercised within constitutional limits. The message to future leaders would be that authority cannot be used to silence dissent, intimidate communities, or pursue political advantage at the expense of rights. Such a precedent would reinforce the idea that in the United States, even the most powerful office must operate under law. That principle lies at the heart of the American constitutional tradition. The events described in Judge Faruqi's courtroom and in related cases highlight a central tension in American democracy: the need to maintain order while preserving liberty. If courts ultimately rule that Donald Trump's Department of Justice abused protesters' rights, the consequences will be profound. For Trump personally, such rulings could bring legal challenges, civil suits, and reputational damage that shape his political future. For the Department of Justice, they would signal the need for reforms and raise questions about how the institution preserves its independence. For the nation, they would mark another chapter in the long history of constitutional crises and corrections, reminding citizens that rights must be defended continuously. The broader meaning lies in the reaffirmation of democratic principles. Courts serve as a check on executive power, and when they act decisively, they protect not only individual defendants, but the integrity of the entire system. The lessons drawn from these cases will influence how future administrations approach dissent, how citizens view their rights, and how the world perceives American democracy. In the end, the answer to the question, what will happen to Donald Trump if courts rule his DOJ abused protesters' rights, is that consequences will unfold across multiple dimensions. Legal liability, political legacy, institutional reform, and historical judgment will all intersect. The precise outcomes may vary, but the overarching impact will be to remind Americans and the world that constitutional democracy remains a living, contested, and resilient tradition.